Welcome back to the London Futurist podcast. Our guest today is a Briton who is based in Berlin, namely Andrew Steele. Earlier in his life, Andrew spent 9 years at the University of Oxford, where, among other accomplishments, he gained a PhD in physics. His focus switched to computational biology, and he held positions at Cancer Research UK and the Francis Crick Institute. Along the way, Andrew decided that aging was the single most important scientific challenge of our time. This led him to write the book Ageless, the new science of getting older without getting old. There are a lot of books these days about the science of slowing, stopping, and even reversing aging. But it's my judgment that Andrew's book is the best general scientific introduction to this whole field. You may have seen Andrew on TV over the years. He regularly appeared as a science expert on the Impossible Engineering show on the Discovery Channel and on the Strangest Things show on Sky. Andrew, this is not the Discovery Channel and it's not Sky TV, but our listeners are very keen to hear what you have to say. Welcome to London Futurists.
Thank you very much. Very excited to be here.
Thank you for joining us, Andrew.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Andrew, could you tell us a bit more about the background that led you to write your book, Ageless?
Yeah, so we have to go right back in time, probably sometime around 2010, 2011. This is when I was finishing up my PhD at Oxford. You know, I was studying physics and I was sort of thinking, what am I going to do with the skills with my life to try and make the maximum impact on the world? And I started reading about aging. And actually, I think I really changed my career because of a graph. And that graph is a surprisingly simple one. It's the graph of how likely you are to die based upon how old you are. And obviously all of us know that the older you are, the more likely you are to get ill or to ultimately die. But the actual numbers just really shocked me. So let's work through this as an example. I'm in my 30s, and that means that my chance of death in any given year is about 1 in 1,000. And I quite like those odds, because if that were to continue for the rest of my life, I'd live into my 1,030s on average, maybe significantly longer if I got lucky. But of course, that doesn't continue, and humans' risk of death doubles about every 8 years. And so what that means is that by the time I'm in my mid-40s, it'll be something like 1 in 500, still not too bad. But if you keep on doubling it and doubling it and doubling it, by the time I make it to my 90s, and if I'm unfortunate enough that medical technology hasn't advanced in the intervening time, my odds of death in one of those years will be about 1 in 6. So that's life and death at the roll of a dice.
So just asking for a friend, do you happen to know what the number is around, let's say, to pick a random number, 63?
Yes. The one that I always remember is 65 is about 1% per year on average.
Ouch.
And it's interesting because, again, that actually isn't too bad if you think about it. If that were to continue indefinitely, you'd live until 165 on average. But the problem is that by the time you're at that sort of level, then 1% is a big enough number that doubling it starts to become a bit more of a significant operation. And so that means that it's in the next sort of 10, 20 years that the trouble really starts. You can look at this as an individual and think, my God, I got this exponential wall of mortality coming at me. Or you can look at it perhaps as a bit of a naive physicist, but I think it turns out this is the truth of the matter. There's this incredibly universal ticking clock in all of our biology. There might not be much in common between me and some undiscovered tribe in the Amazon rainforest. But even though our life expectancies would be quite different, all kinds of things about our lifestyle would be quite different, this 8-year doubling of mortality rate is constant throughout the world, throughout history. It really does seem to be a fundamental fact of human biology. And so what that means is if we could understand what's driving this increase in mortality and this increase in disease that's causing that, maybe we could intervene in that aging process and potentially slow down or even reverse that and tackle all of these diseases at once. And that just really, really excited me. So that's why I ended up deciding to go into biology.
Can I just pick you up on something there? You say that this doubling every 8 years is constant through history. Surely up until the last 200 years or so, everybody died of famine, disease or war. Now, we've got rid of the diseases of youth, mostly, in the developed world. So surely we must be reducing our increase in mortality just because of that, aren't we? And hygiene and lots of other things as well.
Absolutely. If you look at the mortality statistics, the way in which we've been changing human life expectancy over the last few hundred years, I guess the first thing to say that's surprising is that actually nothing really happened for tens of thousands of years in terms of human life expectancy.
Yeah.
When we were hunting and gathering on the plains of whatever, then our life expectancy was broadly similar to, say, a family in the early 19th century who'd just moved to one of our fast-developing cities. It will have been a different spectrum of infectious diseases that took them out, but that was a huge contributor. And what that meant was that you had a roughly 50-50 chance of making it into your 20s. But if you did make it into your 20s, if you dodged all that sort of child and infant mortality, then you had a reasonable chance of living another 50 years or so. So, maybe into your 60s, perhaps even into your 70s, the sort of ages we'd start to call old now. But that mortality rate doubling time was still present. The difference was there was a much larger bump at the beginning of life. Obviously, the first few years were particularly risky. And the other thing, when you're doing the maths of this, there's this doubling every 8 years, but there's also the initial number that you start from when you begin that doubling process. And that background mortality was much, much higher historically. And what we've done very successfully over the years through things like combating infectious disease until about the 1950s, that was basically the only way we were increasing life expectancy. We sort of crushed that background mortality. But even in the last 50 years, as we've got better at treating heart disease, better at treating cancer, and actually started increasing the life expectancy for older people rather than just for younger ones, we still haven't touched that 8-year mortality rate doubling time. So that means that although we're very good at preventing heart disease, we've got better diets and lifestyles, we've stopped smoking, we can treat cancers now, there's nonetheless this sort of ticking biology going on in the background all the time, and we haven't managed to intervene in the aging process itself. Yet.
Oh dear.
As I understand it, you've found various animals that don't have quite the same curve, the so-called Gompertz curve. I believe this was first found by an extended member of the Rothschild family in the 1820s, looking at mortality tables to calculate insurance life premiums. But some animals don't follow this, and you've got a lovely animal on the cover of some of your books.
Yeah, the animal on the cover of quite a few of the books is a tortoise, and that's because it's an animal that's what's called negligibly senescent. And there's another slightly more everyday term for that, which is biological immortality. This doesn't mean actual immortality. Obviously, tortoises don't live forever, but they have a risk of death that's flat with time. And exactly as you say, this model where we have a sort of background risk of death and then an exponential increase on top of that is called the Gompertz model. We can look at humans' mortality rate doubling time. It's every 8 years, as we've already mentioned. You can look at animals at the other end of the mortality spectrum, something like a mouse. Its risk of death doubles every few months, and accordingly might have a much shorter lifespan than us. Callum said, oh dear, when we were talking about the fact we haven't managed to intervene in the aging process yet. The good thing is that we can look around the animal kingdom and see that not all animals obey this Gompertz mortality, or rather they do, but their mortality rate doubling time is infinite, as in it never doubles. Their mortality is flat once they become adults. And so a tortoise has got something like a 1 or 2% chance of dying per year, which is actually quite a lot higher than the human background risk of mortality. But that means that they can just carry on. The oldest recorded Galapagos tortoise was a tortoise called Harriet, who we think was picked up by Charles Darwin on his expedition to the Galapagos Islands. She ended up surviving Darwin by over a century. She eventually died in 2007, aged, I think, about 175. It was quite hard because she wasn't picked up as a new hatched baby tortoise, so we don't know exactly how old she was, but something like 175, 177 years old. This really shows you that if you can flatten out that mortality curve. The other thing that's really exciting about these animals is that it's not just that they don't die, they're not sort of staggering on, frail, unhealthy. They maintain that health. The reason they don't die is that they don't get the diseases, they don't get the cancer, they don't become more frail. Obviously, it's a bit hard to see in tortoises because they're not the most sprightly animals at the best of times. But it's pretty likely that Harriet was just about as mobile, just about as active, just about as disease-free in her 150s as she was in her 50s.
So is it true to say that she didn't age?
I think so, yeah. I call these animals ageless, and I don't think that's an exaggeration. Biologically speaking, I think the best definition of aging we have, at least from a statistical perspective, is this mortality rate doubling time. And so if as a species you don't have one, then you don't age. And that's the really exciting thing about this, is it's a proof of principle. It shows us that aging isn't some fundamental law of biology. It is a contingent fact about particular species. We can talk a bit about why it evolved, but basically there are some species for which it is optimal to age, and there are other species for which it isn't. And if we can learn some of those biological tricks, no longer constrained by the laws of evolution, and start to apply some of those to humans, we can flatten our own curve a bit and become a bit more tortoise, I guess.
There are some big ifs there. You said if we can learn the biological tricks and if we can apply them to humans. So what did you find out in your research? Are there some possible answers to these ifs?
I think so, yeah. And I think the thing that most excited me researching the book, by that time I'd already spent quite a few years working as a computational biologist and sort of reading about aging in the background. So I knew there were these ideas in the pipeline, both understanding what causes aging and treatments to intervene in it. But what really surprised me was just the sheer diversity of approaches we have. It's not like we've got one magic anti-aging pill that we're putting all our money into and hoping for the best. We've got dozens and dozens of different ways that you can slow down, perhaps even reverse aging in animals in the lab. And hopefully some of these are already starting human clinical trials. We should start to see this percolating into human medicine in the not too distant future. I think the best way to think about this is that in the book I break it down into 10 what are called hallmarks of the aging process. These are things that we've observed that change in animals as they age, because obviously in order for a biological process to be contributing to aging, it has to be something that alters as you get older. There are also things that tend to accelerate the aging process if that change is increased, and decelerate the aging process if we intervene to slow it down. And that's because biology is just phenomenally complicated. What we really want to do is identify the causes, the root causes of the aging process. But it's just really challenging because these biological systems are so interlinked. This is a more sort of operational definition. These are sort of the criteria that something would have to fulfill if it were a cause of aging. And then the idea is that if we can intervene in each of these hallmarks, then potentially we can intervene in the aging process as a whole.
I have read your book and I really enjoyed it. I highly recommend it.
Oh, thank you.
At the time I read it, I wasn't thinking of doing a direct comparison between your hallmarks and Aubrey de Grey's 7 causes of cellular damage. Are they comparable, and have you just got 3 more of them, or are they in a different sort of category of thing? We'll be right back after a quick break.
The People in Performance podcast offers insights into the strategic competencies, behaviors, and results needed to increase the performance of employees and leaders. The show looks at all areas of the world of work, including attraction and recruitment, onboarding, training, and succession planning. Tune in to get a better handle on the stages of workforce planning you need to master in order to guarantee long-term success in a rapidly changing world of work. New episodes drop each week. Check out the latest People in Performance episodes on your podcast platform of choice. Follow us on socials and read the latest articles at pppod.com.
It's an interesting question. There are actually quite a lot of different classifications. So mine was based slightly loosely, but nonetheless a little bit more, on a paper called The Hallmarks of Aging, which came out in 2013. And there's actually, literally in the last few weeks, been an update to that paper. So that original 2013 paper had 9 hallmarks. There have been another 3 added in this update that they released just a few weeks ago. Aubrey, as you say, has 7. There's something called the Pillars of Aging. I can't remember how many of those there are. But I think it's just a lot of different ways to skin a cat, basically. There are a lot of processes that everyone agrees on. So Aubrey talks about the accumulation of cells that refuse to die, basically. And these are the senescent cells that are talked about primarily in the hallmarks of aging. And so I think that there are just lots of different ways of categorizing these things. Partly for narrative reasons, but I think also partly because the science has changed slightly. For example, one that's in my hallmarks that wasn't in the 2013 paper and isn't on Aubrey's list is the changes in the microbiome, the changes in the bacteria that live primarily in our guts and have this huge, huge influence on our health. And we've only really started to realise how big that influence is, particularly on aging, in the last 5 years or so. So too late for the hallmarks paper, too late for Aubrey's classification. But actually it was included in this 2022 update of the hallmarks. So, I feel like I got a bit ahead of the curve there.
Right. And it sounds as though you broadly agree with Aubrey's diagnosis that aging is the result of wear and tear, rather than being the result of programmed in obsolescence, which is a rival theory. And I'm sure there are many other theories of aging. Is that right? Are you broadly in agreement that it's wear and tear?
This is a really, really tricky question. And actually, I think that there is a more of a programmed aspect to aging than perhaps the wear and tear idea sounds like it incorporates. Let's rewind back and think about some of those evolutionary mechanisms that I alluded to in an earlier answer. If you think about you're an animal, you're trying to optimize your lifespan. Evolution actually doesn't care how long you live. I'm sorry to say, evolution just isn't bothered by this.
Yeah.
What evolution is bothered about is that you pass your genes on to the next generation. We call evolution survival of the fittest, but I actually think it would be better to call it reproduction of the fittest, because the crucial thing is that you have as many babies as possible, get your genes out there, and they then go on to have more babies of their own, and so on and so on. Evolution will choose you a lifespan based on what will maximize your reproductive potential. Now, let's imagine you're in an environment which is a very dangerous one. Let's say you're a mouse, for example. You're a tiny little animal. There's lots of predators out to get you. There's infectious disease, obviously, in the wild. And you're so small that you could just die of basically being cold. A really, really cold night. Mice, they're tiny. They've got a huge surface area compared to their tiny volume. They can just chill out and die of hypothermia. So there are lots of things in your environment that are hugely hazardous. Given that scenario, if you're evolution, there are broadly 2 buckets in which you can put your energy. You can either put your energy into pumping out as many kids as fast as possible before you get eaten by that cat or frozen to death. Or you could put your energy into really intricate anti-cancer defences that will make sure you never come down with these age-related diseases. And the point being, of course, that mice in the wild will be dead long before they're worrying about anything like heart disease or cancer or dementia. And so those aging defences sort of get sidelined in favour of rapid reproduction. And so you can end up with this concept called antagonistic pleiotropy. It's really unfortunate that all the words in the evolutionary part of the biology of aging are phenomenally overcomplicated. Antagonistic obviously just means in competition with each other. And pleiotropy is the idea that genes can have multiple different functions. And specifically, these genes are in competition with each other across the lifespan. So if you find a gene that improves the way in which you reproduce, but then causes you later in your lifespan to suffer some deleterious and negative consequence, then evolution is going to favour that because it causes that reproduction to be more rapid. Whereas if you're an animal that's got a much longer lifespan, you might think about something like a whale. The reason that a whale is able to evolve that long lifespan is able to wait decades perhaps before it has its first child, and it rears one child at a time over an incredibly extended gestational period compared to a mouse. It's a massive, massive animal. It's a monarch of the oceans, effectively. It hasn't really got particularly many natural predators. And so it can afford to have that chilled out, sedate, extended period during which it builds up its anti-aging defenses. It obviously grows its massive body size as well. So these things are connected. So I think there is a sense in which aging is programmed evolutionarily, because often it's a side effect of programs that are encoded in our genes in order to make us get to this successful age of reproduction faster. And so as a result, I think there's an awful lot of confusion in the sort of wear and tear versus programmed aging discussion.
Would it be fair to say then that the programmed element is what you've earlier called the background risk of mortality, and the wear and tear is the doubling?
I think the programmed element actually causes that doubling, in part, because I think some of it is clearly wear and tear. And let's take a really non-technical biological example here. Humans have 2 sets of teeth. This is a good example for both sides of the coin. Humans have 2 sets of teeth. We have our baby teeth, and then in our sort of early teenage years, probably, or a bit before that, we'll lose our milk teeth and get our adult teeth. And the fact is, from a wear and tear point of view, our teeth just wear out. It's as simple as that. So that's sort of an argument in favour of the wear and tear side. And obviously there are more complicated biological examples, but if we're just going to start with that, it's a nice simple one. However, if you want to view that from a programmed aging point of view, sharks have constantly renewing teeth. They have teeth that are constantly coming through. And it's a genetic biological program that has designed humans to only have 2 sets of teeth, because perhaps the demands on our teeth in our prehistoric lifestyle were not sufficient to require us to waste all that energy that we could otherwise have spent catching more food or having more kids on producing this continuous train of teeth, as it were. So I think it's really hard to separate out the wear and tear and the programmed aging.
Mm-hmm.
I started off trying to give an example of wear and tear and ended up talking about programmed aging. I think this is messier than it seems, but I also think it's much less important than the debate is typically portrayed as, because what we need to do isn't to argue over the absolute minutiae of what's causing any particular change. We need to identify those changes and identify the most effective way to intervene in them. And I don't think understanding exactly which theory gives rise to it is always that important.
When people talk about aging as programmed in, they sometimes suggest, well, in that case, we could change the program. We could alter the metabolism so that, for example, we continue to grow new teeth throughout our lives. Whereas when people talk about we need to repair the damage, it's more of an engineering point of view. Let's leave the metabolism alone. If we mess with the metabolism, we might cause other problems, but let's just intervene by going to the dental hygienist who will clean out our teeth and polish them and repair them. Where are you on that spectrum? Do you think there might be a few tweaks to our metabolism, our genes, that could give us a lot extra lifespan, health span? Or should we instead be thinking more broadly about engineering interventions?
I think I'm quite pragmatic on this. I know this is something that Aubrey de Grey always talks about, but actually I think that, again, it's just really, really hard. These things don't neatly divide into 2 buckets. I think there are all kinds of interventions that we're thinking about, whether or not you'd call them engineering or interventions in metabolism. The most effective mechanism we have for intervening in aging in lab animals is dietary restriction. And that's where you feed these animals an awful lot less. And I'm not just talking about a little bit of a diet here. I'm not talking about cutting back on calories. These animals are eating like 40% less than they would eat if they were allowed to eat what they liked. And what you find is that these animals that are given this diet tend to live a lot longer, and they do so in good health. So if we take the example of the very first ever experiment that was done in rats in the 1930s, a scientist called Clive Mackay got a bunch of rats, allowed some to eat what they liked, and gave another 2 groups of these rats this calorie-restricted diet, but with optimal nutrition. So they made sure that they were getting all of the essential nutrients that the rats needed to survive. And what they found was those rats, they did live a lot longer, and they did live a lot longer in good health. In fact, they lived about half as long again as the rats that were eating whatever they wanted. This shows us, firstly, it's a really important demonstration, again, that aging is malleable. It's not some fixed biological fact. But secondly, I wouldn't call this an engineering intervention. This feels more like a sort of metabolism intervention, because you're fundamentally changing, you're switching the mice into some kind of mode that preserves their bodies rather than rapidly reproducing. And you could imagine that perhaps this is some kind of mechanism that evolved in the wild, because the mice, if there is a famine in their environment, they want to preserve themselves so they can reproduce later, perhaps having their kids born into a world where there isn't a massive food shortage. So you can see why this thing might have evolved. And as a result, one of the most effective non-diet interventions, because obviously this is a very, very hard thing to stick to, whenever I've tried fasting or eating less, it's quite a challenge. There's this sort of joke in aging biology that maybe calorie restriction doesn't make you live any longer, but it'll certainly feel like longer. So, ideally we'd like to package this up in a pill. And accordingly, our most effective anti-aging intervention in the lab is a pill called rapamycin, which goes in and intervenes in a part of the biochemistry that was identified to be relevant to calorie restriction. Is that an engineering approach? Is that altering the metabolism approach? I sort of don't care. I just want to do whatever will have the greatest impact on our longevity, on our health span, most importantly going forward. And so I think it's just a question of trying things out, coming up with theories, trying to put them into operational practice. And actually, ultimately, to sort of skip right to the very end of my book, what I end up talking about in the final science chapter is the idea of coming up with these computational biology models, a sort of systems biology model, it's called, of human biology, which will allow us to understand how all these different things interact together, how all the different hallmarks interact, how something like calorie restriction, how that might work. I ultimately think that these things aren't going to be describable by human language in any particularly simple way. We're going to have some bizarre intervention where we give some seemingly random combination of drugs or gene therapies or cells or goodness knows what, and somehow through some sort of convoluted path, it'll bring our biology back into the sort of stable state that we're all in youth that allows us to have these low probabilities of death. And so I think trying to artificially break aging interventions into different categories, perhaps it's somewhat useful. I think the hallmarks are a useful framework so it doesn't just seem like this complete systems biology mess when you're trying to learn about it. But at the same time, I ultimately am very pragmatic about let's do what works.
One discussion about the hallmarks is whether some are more fundamental than others. One suggestion is, well, if there are 12 hallmarks, we need to do 12 different things to decelerate each of them. But other researchers, I understand, are quite confident that a single intervention in one of the hallmarks might make a huge difference. For example, there's a researcher called Bill Andrews who advocates focusing entirely on lengthening telomeres, which are the ends of chromosomes and which tend to get shorter as years pass. And there is some evidence that shorter telomeres eventually causes all kinds of problems. There's another researcher, David Sinclair, who advocates repairing the so-called epigenetic damage, which is quite technical, but it's not changes in our genes as we age, but changes in the stuff that gets packaged up around in the skin of our genes, as it were. And he suggests there's research, which backed up by some people in Altos Lab, which has received a lot of funding recently, that if we could do the reversing of that particular damage, it could have wide implications for the other hallmarks. Does your research into computational biology suggest whether we're going to need 12 interventions, 112 interventions, or might we find indeed 2 or 3 that will do the trick?
I obviously hope the answer is 1, but I'm not confident. And I think this is one of the things that slightly concerns me about sometimes this almost hype within science about particular interventions. I am really excited that Altos Labs exists. I think $3 billion of funding, which is sort of what they're rumoured to have from these various venture capital backers, including Jeff Bezos, the Amazon founder. That's enough money to actually have a serious go at understanding what's changing in our epigenomes as we age and trying to develop some kind of therapy to reverse it. But although I don't know the answer, I need to see the experiment in order to find out what works. There are some reasons to believe that more than one intervention might be required. So let's take the example of that epigenetic intervention. We know that this sort of packaging of the DNA, as you talked about, changes as we get older. It's one of the most accurate clocks that we've got for biological age as opposed to the chronological age, the number of candles on your birthday cake, is understood by looking at these epigenetic changes, and you can therefore work out not only how old someone is, but more morbidly how likely they are to die and so on, by analysing these epigenetic marks all over their DNA. So clearly something is going on. But let's imagine we can revert that epigenome into a perfectly youthful state. We can turn everyone back so they've got the epigenome of a 20-year-old. They're in this sort of biologically ideal state in that respect. Well, the epigenome is decorating all over your DNA, and we know that you accumulate DNA mutations as you get older. And we've got various theories at the moment as to why that might be more significant than we thought in the past. So, for example, if you look at your skin, the skin of someone who's an older adult tends to be just a patchwork of mutated clones. So what you find is they've often had 1 or 2 errors in the DNA that allow those skin cells to reproduce more successfully than a cell that doesn't have those mutations. And that means it's bound to evolution on a microscopic scale on the surface of your skin. It's bound to outcompete those surrounding skin cells and expand. It's called a clonal expansion. And wherever we look in the body, whether it's the lining of the intestines, all over the place, we see this accumulation of these clonally expanding cells. And as a result, DNA damage, although it was thought for a long time, might not be that significant a contributor to aging. Conversely, some people thought it was the single cause of aging. It seems unlikely that the epigenetic fixes are going to be able to solve that problem, because if you've got a huge number of mutated cells, you're going to have to deal with those somehow. And then we've got to zoom out outside the cell. So obviously there are a lot of problems that happen inside the cell. There's all kinds of different sorts of dysfunction in there. But then between our cells, there's all kinds of important stuff as well. And I think perhaps the easiest to understand of those are problems with the proteins outside of our cell. When you think of protein, you probably think of the nutrition labels on the side of food, but actually protein is the most important category of molecules in biology. They're the molecular machines that allow our bodies to function. They're also the building blocks, the scaffolding that holds our body together. And so a really good example of this is collagen, which is a fundamental protein that forms the structure of our skin. It's also the fundamental protein that forms the structure of huge swathes of our body. It's the single most common protein. And in different forms of collagen, your bones, your skin, your arteries, all different components are held together by a scaffolding, a mesh of these collagen molecules. But as we get older, this collagen gets modified and it can get damaged. And what that means is that even if we were to fix the epigenome, there's no guarantee that the cells would renew that collagen outside of their cells. In fact, we don't think they would, because a lot of collagen seems to have a lifespan of months, years, even decades perhaps in certain parts of the body. And so it just seems dangerous to me to assume that we're going to be able to go in, fix the epigenome, and that will solve the problems of DNA mutations, sort of at the more fundamental level, and at the wider scale, the problems that are going on all around the outside of those cells as well. Even if we have perfectly youthful cells, if they're in this sort of aged environment, then we're not necessarily going to find the most success. So I think we really should be going after all, let's say 12 of the hallmarks of aging, because what will happen is, firstly, we'll have a sort of suite of treatments that we can draw upon, and depending on which are the most important, we can deploy those treatments in the most effective way. And secondly, by developing these treatments, we can understand how these phenomena are interconnected. And if there is one that does seem to be more fundamental than another, or if there are a few in combination that can have this huge outsized effect and we don't need the other 10, boo-hoo, we've got a bunch of extra biological understanding and are all living a lot longer and healthier.
Yeah.
So I really think it's dangerous to tie yourself to any particular horse at this particular moment in time. We've just got to wait and see what the science says.
So we mustn't put all our eggs into one basket. It sounds like you're optimistic, but you decided that there's many, many complex interacting factors which we need to address to fix aging. And perhaps we need a large language model thinking in about 1 billion different dimensions to work it out. And we won't understand its answer, but we'll benefit from it, which is similar to Aubrey de Grey's approach. And I wonder whether you agree with his optimism at the moment. I'm sure you know that because of the increase in funding that's happened in the space recently, he now thinks that he can get to robust mouse rejuvenation within 2 or 3 years. Mice are too short-lived to enjoy longevity escape velocity, which is the idea that every year that passes, medical science gives you another year back. But you can give them an extra year of life. So if they're a 4-year lifespan animal that's at 2 years, you give it another year, and that's robust mouse rejuvenation. And he thinks that would be proof of concept that longevity escape velocity is possible. And he thinks that could then happen for humans in about 15 years. Do you have any thoughts on that timeline?
I feel like one of the common problems that we have in all kinds of science is assigning timescales measured in years rather than in research dollars. And I very much hope Aubrey's right and these things happen as quickly as that suggests. And I have a lot of optimism about the development of therapies in general. Senolytics, which are these therapies that go in and kill these aged senescent cells that I mentioned in an answer earlier, they've been shown to improve the lifespans, the health spans of mice. And there are already 20 or 30 companies trying to put this into practice and develop senolytics for the treatment of actual diseases. But it's just very, very challenging to put hard numerical timescales on things. And I really do feel like the field as a whole needs more funding, because although there's plenty of money now going into this rejuvenation of the epigenetic clock, there's plenty of money actually going into senolytics as well, because they've got this demonstrated proof of concept in mice. And as I said, there are already a couple of dozen companies trying to do this in humans. That still leaves, depending on how you exactly enumerate the hallmarks of aging, say 8 or 9 or 10 that aren't being properly addressed. And it'll be absolutely tragic if we become fantastic at removing senescent cells and brilliant at rejuvenating our epigenomes, but it turns out that one of those other hallmarks kills us. And so I think there's just a huge, huge space here to advocate for funding, particularly from governments, because I think that governments don't realise the importance of investing in this stuff. And because a lot of these hallmarks, although the people who founded Altos, I'm not quite sure what drove them to make a private investment. Maybe it's sort of partly they see it as philanthropic. Obviously, there's this standard idea that maybe the billionaires just want to live a little bit longer in order to spend some of their huge accumulated wealth. I don't know what motivated them. But whatever it was, I feel like it can't necessarily have been business. Or at least it can't have been purely business. Because although these therapies are going to be hugely, hugely impactful if they're developed, epigenetic reprogramming is actually one of the more speculative ideas in aging biology, I would say. And so, these therapies, at the moment, they're delivered by genetically modifying mice. I think there's been a paper just recently where they actually provided that genetic modification in adulthood rather than in youth. But the perfect use case would be to create a small molecule drug, a pill basically, that we can take rather than having to go in and modify our genes. And if we do have to modify our genes, that's going to be 5 or 10 or 15 years away, certainly, before we can think about doing that. There are gene therapies in the clinic, but they're certainly not safe enough that we're going to hand them out to people who are 65 and otherwise healthy. So in a sense, that was foresightful of the investors in Altos to think there's this technology that's not going to be ready yet, but with an investment, perhaps we can get it to that point. But the other hallmarks of aging, maybe they're not quite so sexy for whatever reason. I think they are equally near stroke far. They're not hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars worth of investment away from working. They're perhaps only a few billion, maybe even 10 billion, which sounds like a huge amount of money, but it's an amount of money that we could be stumping up as a civilization.
Yeah.
Given the huge potential consequences.
Exactly. That's a really interesting idea, that rather than being a certain number of years away, it's a certain number of billions of dollars away. So this is, again, an impossible question, but how many billions of dollars away is longevity escape velocity, do you think?
It's a great question. And I think it depends a bit on how you break it down. I think the simplest approach I would go for is something like $100 billion, which sounds like a huge amount of money, but it's actually only $100 per person in the rich world. So there are about a billion of us living in the high-income countries. And if you obviously multiply 100 by a billion, you get $100 billion. So that means for a relatively small amount of money, we could stick something like 10 billion into each hallmark of aging. Maybe we should stick in 5 billion into each hallmark and do some sort of broader exploratory research to find out if there are any hallmarks we've missed and so on. But nonetheless, I think this would give us a really serious stab at doing it. But to clarify, that's sort of the basic science side, and perhaps even a bit beyond the basic science side, the first few clinical trials. But hopefully, by the time you've demonstrated that proof of principle through public funding of that stuff, then it's going to come a point where you don't have to be foresightful Jeff Bezos, or perhaps over-optimistic Jeff Bezos, as I say. I'm not sure entirely what motivated him. It's going to be far more sort of basic, everyday farmer investors, biotech VCs who are going to be looking at this and saying, wow, this has got so much proof of principle. We've got so many candidate molecules coming out of the lab that could potentially be anti-aging drugs. Suddenly it's going to become a much simpler investment proposition. And so having invested that 100 billion up front, the clinical trials are often the most expensive part, because you've got to give these drugs out to tens of thousands of people, perhaps, if they're going to be something that we're going to be giving out to otherwise healthy people. You want to be very sure of their safety. And so that's the part where you really need pharmaceutical companies, you really need investors involved, because it's just a huge amount of money. But then the potential target market for all of these things is every living human. So there's a huge, huge return to be made there as well.
Andrew, some people don't like this kind of talk at all. They offer so-called moral or ethical objections to the idea of getting governments to spend more money so that some people can live healthier and longer. Do you have any sympathies at all for that way of thinking?
I do, yeah. And I think I'd be fascinated to go back and talk to myself circa 2010, 2011, when I was first getting into these ideas, and just hear what my knee-jerk, off-the-cuff reactions would be. Because one of the questions that I get after every single talk that I do is, this is all well and good, Andrew, you've talked all about health, this all sounds very exciting, but what about overpopulation? We're already living on a world that's being strained environmentally in a number of different ways. If we're going to have people living longer lives, that's just going to put more strain on the planet, isn't it? And I think this is something that I've got a lot of sympathy with. I almost actually, when I was thinking at the end of my PhD, I mentioned I was sort of casting around, trying to work out how to make the biggest impact with my life. I almost became a climate physicist because I could have used those same sort of numerical, analytical skills to understand the climate system and try and come up with ways that we could intervene with climate change, which is hugely, hugely important. It's one of the defining problems of our era, I would say. However, when you actually drill down into the numbers, what sounds intuitively like a really serious problem with aging biology is much less serious than it first appears. Let's just take a really simple example. If you look at the UN's population model, so this is the United Nations' best guess at what's going to happen to population over the next sort of 50 years or 100 years or so. What you can see is that by 2050, the population of the Earth is going to be about 9.8 billion people in their medium variant, so their sort of best guess, most likely scenario. And that's up from a population, I think we just passed 8 billion according to the best model. So we've got maybe another 1, 2, 3 billion people coming down the pike in the next sort of few decades' time. If you were to literally cure aging, and obviously let's just emphasize how ridiculous an idea this is, but if we were to do that by 2025, that means you not only have to sort out all the science problems, which I don't think are multitudinous and is going to take 400 years or anything, but we have to sort them all out in the next couple of years, which is very implausible. And then we have to roll out all of those drugs to literally everyone in the world, in every country, rich, poor, whatever it might be. Even if we were to literally do that in the next couple of years, then the population in 2050, rather than being 9.8 billion people, would be about 11.3 billion. Now, is that a lot or a little? Well, on the one hand, it's another 1.5 billion extra people. It sounds like a lot of extra mouths to feed, a lot of extra carbon dioxide, a lot of extra resources that are going to be required. But on the other hand, it's only about a 16% increase. And that's the most important thing, because I think one of the wrong-headed things that often comes up in these discussions of population, it's not the people that are the problem, it's the resources that we use. And by 2050, we've got to hope that we're very much on a path toward net zero carbon, net zero, all kinds of impacts, land use, all kinds of things that we're doing to the environment that are hugely damaging the planet. Even if we don't have any more people, even if we could somehow freeze the population at today, we're basically going to have to reduce the impact per person to zero. And I would happily work 16% harder to nail down all these problems if it meant that we didn't have any cancer, we didn't have any Alzheimer's, we didn't have any heart disease, all of these age-related problems. Because I think the thing that's often lost sight of, and this is the sort of general retort I have to any ethical objection to treating aging, aging is the single largest cause of death in the world. If you add up all the deaths that happen all around the world, it's about 150,000 people every single day. And of those, more than 100,000, so more than 2/3, are caused by aging. This isn't just in the rich countries, by the way. In the rich countries, it's more like 85-90% of deaths are caused by aging. But globally, it's something like 70%. And if you think about how these people die, there's a sort of myth that you can die of old age. You just go to bed one night and wake up, or rather don't wake up the next morning dead with no intervening pain. But actually, if you think about cancer, that can be years and years of grueling treatment, of worry. If you think about heart disease, you slowly lose the functionality of your heart. You're less able to get around. You can't do your hobbies. You can't play with your grandkids. It slowly saps your independence. And something like dementia, it takes away your personality. It takes away your memories. It takes away the very essence of you. And often, a lot of these things are happening simultaneously. You're getting a bit of cognitive decline, even as you battle with your cancer, even as you battle with a little bit of heart disease. You're becoming frail. You're basically less able to be a human. And this is a huge, huge humanitarian cost. In fact, I describe it in the book as the world's greatest humanitarian crisis, because we've got over 2/3 of deaths, and all of those deaths preceded by years, maybe even decades of suffering. And so, if we can deal with that, but we have to work 16% harder to sort out climate change, that is a trade I'd very much make. And just to emphasize the example that I gave just then, that was literally curing aging in a couple of years' time. The more likely scenario is that we gradually live healthier, we gradually live a little bit longer all around the world. And that means that population change is going to be something that we can deal with a lot more gradually. And so it's going to be an even smaller change with a similarly big benefit. And so I just think it's an absolute no-brainer. But in order to get some more detail about this, I know, David, you've written a whole book on this, which is excellent. I highly recommend. And there's also a free bonus chapter of my book online. If you go to ageless.link/ethics, then there's an ethics chapter which sort of lays out a lot of these arguments in more detail.
Finally, Andrew, what are you working on next? Is there a new book called More Ageless? Or are you just immersed in your computational biological models?
At the moment, specifically, I'm really working on quite a lot of YouTube videos. So I've got a YouTube channel which you can check out, youtube.com/Dr. Andrew Steele. There are videos on a variety of science topics. There are quite a lot of them on aging biology for reasons that will hopefully have been obvious during the course of this chat. And I am working on another book as well. That's a bit under wraps at the moment because it's still at the proposal stage, which is where you sort of write an idea down and see if any publishers will let you write it. But you've already had a bit of a hint about it, actually. It's going to be about something around science funding and other methods of changing the world, as well as developing treatments for aging. So it's going to be thinking about how we fund science, what the bang for the buck could potentially be. And I think there are going to be lots of topics in there that are of interest to futurists. So hopefully everyone listening, please do watch this space.
Andrew, that's a lot to think about. I wish you every success in getting that book out quickly. It's a topic that comes up often as well. How should we be funding science? How do we decide what to do? And where are the possible pots of money that can be leveraged? Thanks so much for sharing your insight with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Andrew. Clearly, we should all be more tortoise.
Good advice to end on.